Martha, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to cover the topics we're going to talk about today. I've taken personal interest in the gut health side of things and blood-brain barrier just for out of personal interest. I've also spoken to folks in the functional medicine side of things when it comes to our gut health, but I do want to understand some of the science, and hopefully we could share that with the listeners today and how we can manage our gut health better. What are some things we need to be mindful of, but at the same time, some of the implications that we're understanding now with as science advances, obviously, and the work you've been doing. So before we jump into all of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what's brought you here today.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about what I've learned all these years. So, my background actually was originally in school in accounting. I came out and went to work in auditing, which is something where they teach you not to take anything at face value, to examine the evidence for yourself. And so that kind of set in motion a mindset for me. And they trained us in how to look at a business, to identify risk by mapping out in a flow chart everything that's flowing through the business. Fast forward from that in the 1980s to 2002, when my 44-year-old young, healthy husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I
Mm,
thought, how can a young person who is seemingly healthy have Parkinson's disease? And so I started to look at it from that systems-based perspective, and I started studying food and how we grow our food and kind of expanded into all these fields of science that ultimately come together in something called the microbiome, which I had never heard of at that time. And in 2014, so that was 12 years later, I read a book called Missing Microbes by Dr. Martin Blazer. And he was talking about growing up in the age of antibiotics and
mhm,
how that may be contributing to the rise in chronic disease from the loss of the healthy microbiome. And the microbiome, which is your internal factory that is
mhm.
producing hormones, neurotransmitters, it's digesting your food, and it's, this critical, I'll say, organ system
Yes.
that nobody had ever really heard of a decade ago, except for a few people in the lab. And later that year, a paper was published that showed you could identify the two primary types of Parkinson's. You could differentiate them by the bacteria in the gut. And I was like, Eureka, that's like in accounting, it must be the general ledger that
Yeah.
tells you the state of things and it has to balance. And so I quit what I was doing in my previous career and started to fund research at the University of Chicago and went on to found a company called the Bowel Collective, which was collecting fecal samples from across the population and making them available to scientists for early research and doing some of our own research and computational modeling. And we moved from that into looking at how we could use this systems thinking to develop systems based probiotics to restore functions to the gut.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. And one of the things I've come to understand, and I do want to get your thoughts, that our gut health, as you've touched on, is not only important for our physical health, but even our mental health, right? And if there's dysbiosis or if we're experiencing leaky gut, all these things are obviously affecting our physical health, but they can take a toll on our mental health as well. But I do want to understand from your perspective, what are your thoughts around some of that connection in terms of how it affects us mentally as well?
So that was actually one of the early areas that I looked into, and I found a researcher who was a pioneer in the field of what's called microbial endocrinology. And we think of the endocrine system as producing hormones. And what he had shown is that bacteria in the gut are producing hormones and they are communicating with the brain. And it's a two-way communication. And that's happening through the vagus nerve in the body and also biochemically throughout the body. But what happens is you can get, so let's say you're under psychological stress, and so you start to produce a certain hormonal profile that's catecholamines from
Yeah.
stress. And that feeds a certain profile of gut bacteria. And then they can start to drive you to be more stressful because they have the neurotransmitters that help them grow. So you get more of those bacteria in the gut. So it becomes this kind of vicious circle. And
Mm.
so part of that is calming down the external stressors, but also addressing what's in the gut contributing to that.
Yeah, and I would assume because a lot of people, when they're stressed, they're not eating well either, right? So then you're further perpetuating the issue by not feeding your gut the right
Right. So,
nutrient. Yeah.
yes. So, setting up your terrain and having proper nutrition for yourself, but also for the microbes. Because if there's not enough quality nutrition for you, there's not enough quality nutrition for the microbiome. And then they can break down your own tissues to get what they need. So that
Yeah.
can also become a vicious cycle.
Yes, absolutely. And how does the blood-brain barrier fit into this aspect too? Obviously, the two systems are somewhat separate, but we've talked about this where the blood-brain barrier has a specific function, obviously around what's allowed through the endothelial cells, but then there's certain molecules that can pass through. A lot of the times we're not even aware of what we're consuming and digesting, but how that's even affecting the blood-brain barrier protective mechanism of what's reaching
Right.
the brain. So are you able to speak to that a little bit as well?
Blood brain barrier is this very selective barrier that decides what can get in and get out. And if you have a damaged blood brain barrier, that's obviously going to let in things that you don't want to come in. But let's take a step back to the lining of the gut, the lining of the blood vessels, and the blood brain barrier, and to all of our cells. They're all surrounded by this fuzzy layer that is called the glycocalyx. And that is a sulfated polymer that, so the glycocalyx and the endothelial surface layer, and that the polymers that come off of that are seaweed. That's
Mm.
the probably the best example you could look at. That is, in seaweed, it's filtering the ocean. This is actually acting like a selective filter. It's a selective filter in our gut, it's in our blood vessels, it's in our brain. And so when that barrier gets damaged, and it often starts in the gut, it will get damaged, and then you will have bacterial toxins that cross over into the bloodstream and cause inflammation. And then that inflammation can move throughout the body and cause damage in other areas. And when we look at neurological diseases, it's often neuroinflammation. So it is something that is getting into the brain, causing inflammation that shouldn't be there.
Mhm. Okay. No, that's helpful. And then let's maybe talk about what's causing the collapse of the microbiome. So obviously, like the diet we have today in today's world is not conducive to microbial health, right? That's definitely coming to the forefront. But can you help us understand what are the things that we're consuming in the day to day that's affecting our gut health?
One of the biggest things is really the volume of processed foods. If we look at food today, it's often prepackaged or components that have been put together in a food, so it's not a whole real food that you grew and pulled out of the ground or an animal from the farm down the road. There's a lot of processing that's going into our foods. And in the process of making processed foods, there's also a lot of use of preservatives for shelf life. Well, we don't think about preservatives in terms of microbes often, but a preservative is there to keep the food from rotting or molding or these types of things, which means there's an antimicrobial nature to those preservatives. And I use hummus at the store, like somebody gets a tub of hummus. People love hummus, but hummus, it has to have a protective antibacterial coating on the top of it, or it's a perfect petri dish for microbes. And you can see that in your refrigerator after you've opened it, if you leave it in there too long. But when you eat those preservatives, they're anti-enzymatic, they're antibacterial, and of course, the digestive process in the body involves enzymes to break down the food, and those are produced by bacteria. So we're eating a lot of, small bits of antimicrobial things in all these different foods that we're getting that people don't even realize. So I'll talk to people about antibiotics, and they say, I haven't had antibiotics in 20 years. There's also widespread use of antibiotics in animal husbandry. Now, there's been some work to get that removed from the system, but I think they discovered in the 1950s that giving cattle antibiotics in the feed could make them gain weight faster. So they started to use antibiotics as a growth promoter. Let's think about our population and the weight gain that we've seen.
Yes.
Well, that shift in the microbiome actually changes the metabolic profile in there and can initiate more loading of fat onto the body, which is what we see in the animals. And then, of course, if you're eating them, then you're being exposed to what they've been exposed to.
Right.
And I think people don't really think about the fact that, you are what you eat, but also what they ate.
Yeah.
And that can be a plant or an animal.
Yes. And so what I'm hearing from you is it doesn't matter where in the food chain it's being introduced. The problem is that it's in the food chain. And what about like GMOs and other hormones that are often being added to food, or even pesticides? That's all getting into the food chain as well. Are you able to speak to some of that also on top of the antibiotics that we obviously know maybe we're not consuming it directly, it's coming from in the food chain, but what are the other issues we're seeing within the food chain?
One of the areas that I've spent a lot of time looking at is GMO soy. I started early on looking at GMO soy because the 2 years preceding my husband's Parkinson's diagnosis, he had actually been drinking a soy protein shake every morning for breakfast. And so I started to look pretty deeply into that. And there's a researcher, his name is Andre Leu, Leu, who did a study in 2014 that overlaid the growth and the use of GMO crops in corn and soy and the use of glyphosate and about 20 different chronic diseases. And Parkinson's was one of those, but pretty much the gambit of what we see rising in America. And glyphosate is also antibacterial. It has been patented as an antibiotic, but what's interesting and peculiar about it is it kills the beneficial bacteria, but there are a number of pathogens that are resistant to it. And that's the same thing is true in plants. So we're having more and more issues with fungal toxins, mycotoxins in the grains and in the food supply. And aspergillus in particular is resistant to glyphosate. So the more glyphosate you use, the more mycotoxins from something like an aspergillus you may get. And then we have these glyphosate residues actually in the plants. And that's actually gotten worse in the last decade because now that herbicide is used in about 60 crops to dry them at the end of harvest. So, of course, at the end of harvest, you're going to be left with a lot more residue on that plant than, say, if you had used that at the beginning and the plant had metabolized it and the environment had cleared it. So I think that's a really underappreciated thing. There's also many chemicals, particularly used in the United States. There's a number of them that are no longer used in other areas of the world because of safety concerns. They're used here. And I wrote a blog a number of years ago. There's a researcher at UCLA. Her name is Beata Ritz. And she studied for more than 20 years, I think, the region in California where most of the Central Valley, and that's where about 50% of the produce in America is grown. And they have something like 8 times the rate of Parkinson's. And she studied these different chemicals and the wind, and people don't think about that often. But
Yes.
when I'm talking to people who have Parkinson's, I will often find that there was a connection to living near a farming area, either when they grew up or in some proximity to when they got Parkinson's. So you can get it in the air from if they're spraying near you, or you can get it in the food. So these agricultural chemicals are a big contributor to what's disrupting our microbiome, but we're also exposed to thousands more chemicals than we were 100 years ago. And that can also come through our water supply. So people often think, oh, America's tap water is safe. Our tap water is not great. And that, in large part, is because our water treatment systems were designed 100 or so years ago to deal with bacteria, but they weren't designed to deal with the chemical load that we deal with now.
Right.
So if you think like your next door neighbor is taking an antibiotic or an opioid or whatever the drug is, some portion of that is eliminated through the urine.
Yes.
Unaltered. And that goes into the water system. The Environmental Working Group, I think that was also back in about 2012, did a study of 20 major cities and showed all the pharmaceutical pollution that was, in the public water system. So I always tell people it's very important to filter your water, but if you're filtering your water, then you need to add minerals back, because those minerals are what are key to making those enzymes work in the body. That's another really underappreciated thing, is that people don't realize what they're exposed to through the water.
Yes. There's other issues that have come to the surface around fluoride being added to water. So that's another issue. And then one thing we haven't touched on is the chemicals that are being introduced as well, that are all around us. So I want to parse that a little bit, but let's talk about fluoride. What are your thoughts on that, and why are we adding fluoride to our water?
I'm not a fluoride expert, but what I can tell you is we have filtered our water for 25 years since my husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. But even a lot of the water filters don't get all of the fluoride out. Fluoride is very reactive. So I think that's another thing that's underappreciated, is when you have these molecules that can react with a lot of different things, they can make compounds inside the body that, are quite different and can have varying levels of toxicity. I haven't looked specifically at how fluoride affects the microbiome, but I think that would be really interesting. And I'll bet there is somebody probably who has looked at that in a publication that we could find, but I have not looked at it specifically.
Okay. Fair enough. And then what about like the chemicals, like plastic, for example, that's all around us? We're obviously absorbing it, but then it's also going into our food and water. So again, there's only so much you can do based on your level of awareness. But I think having that level of awareness is also important when it comes to the chemicals that are coming from plastics, or even like other toxins, whether it's scented candles and all that kind of stuff. I don't think people truly appreciate the effect that's having on our bodies.
Another piece of that is actually scents, flavors, artificial flavors. So there's a nonprofit in New Jersey by the name of Manel, and it's funded by the food industry. And they are probably the most knowledgeable in the world about taste and smell receptors and how to trick them with artificial molecules to make you want to eat more food. You go to the store now, I don't buy chips anymore, but that used to be my demon, a bag of potato chips. But now, like, you go, there's a whole entire aisle in the grocery store, and probably 40 different flavors. And all of those are artificial, and they're artificially designed to trick the sensors in your body. And it's not just sensors in our nose and our tongue, it's all the way through the GI tract. This sensing in the glycocalyx that's going on and saying, what should I let in? What should I keep out? And this tricking of the senses, and whether that is a candle with an artificial scent or some of these colognes and things or soaps that are just, to me, they're overwhelming because I don't use anything like that. But yeah, they're all very disruptive.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of it is evolutionary wise, there was a reason why we had this capacity within us to seek out fats or even sugars just because they were so rare to get. But now it's coming in abundance. And as you're talking about, artificial flavors, just over consumption of sugar. And I think a lot of times people get stuck in the sugar conversation too. It's not that sugar's bad for us, it's the way it's processed and how we're consuming it. And one of the culprits that keeps coming up is high fructose corn syrup that's in soft drinks and other sugary foods. How is that affecting us as well? Because that is taking a toll on our gut health as well when we're consuming these types of sugars.
Fructose is particularly damaging, and there's work by Dr. Richard Johnson about fructose in particular, about sugars. Nature Wants Us to Be Fat is his book.
Yeah.
But in the high fructose corn syrup, of course, it's concentrated. The sweetness is concentrated. And also, most of it's coming from corn, which is the GMO corn, and it's grown with glyphosate. So you're going to have concentration of all the residues and things that it's grown in,
Mhm.
concentrated into that high fructose corn syrup. And fructose used to be something we would get occasionally from fruit, and now it's in this super concentrated format, and it feeds a more pathogenic profile of bacteria as well. When you're continuing to put high fructose corn syrup into the microbiome, you're selecting for a less friendly profile of gut bacteria.
Mhm.
And that was actually one of the drivers behind the original probiotic we made. It wasn't to get rid of fructose originally. It was actually to produce something called mannitol, it's a free radical scavenger. It's a sugar alcohol, and it had been shown in a Parkinson study to stop the aggregation of the proteins that were involved and actually pull them out of the animal's brain. And so we looked at building a system of microbes that could convert that excess glucose and fructose that is so prevalent in the Western diet into mannitol, which we basically eliminate through urine and feces.
Mm. No, that's definitely helpful. And the other thing you had mentioned to me is that the gut microbiome is aerobic. Are you able to explain why that is something that important to know?
So the gut, I mean, if you think about it, it's a tube. It should be anaerobic. It should not be oxygen
Right.
in there. And what we started to see very, very early on in going to conferences and seeing people presenting the different microbial profiles, my chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Cano, was a microbial ecologist with about 35 years experience at Cal Poly. And, he looked at it and he said, what I see across these is the gut has become aerobic. And so that fosters an environment that there are certain like bifidobacteria and Akkermansia that are known for promoting a healthy gut. Both of those are not oxygen tolerant at all. Like a molecule of oxygen, they're out of here. And so
Right.
you start to lose that profile of healthy bacteria, and bifidobacteria in particular were colonized with, are supposed to be, as babies. And that trains our immune system and keeps a number of the pathogens in check. It's very important for brain health. We found in collecting samples from healthy centenarians that they had a higher level of bifidobacteria. And so when you get an aerobic gut that has oxygen in there, you're getting a profile of pathogenic bacteria that are more likely to be endotoxin producing, which is inflammatory. And endotoxin has been many chronic disease models use endotoxin to initiate the inflammatory cascade that drives the disease.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And coming back to what got you into this space, the Parkinson's side of things, and some of the other things I've come to understand is there's also some root causes to dementia as well, where people are experiencing that memory loss and all of that. So, how is the gut playing a role in some of these diseases or conditions we see people experience? And as you said, in your husband's case, at 44.
Yeah, so there's actually some really interesting research from a group at Harvard, Rudy Tanzi and Robert Moore. Robert passed away a few years back, but they were early pioneers in looking at Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's, one of the proteins that they've looked at for a long time is something called beta amyloid. That is actually what's called an antimicrobial peptide. And what they found was that it didn't matter what the microbial toxin was or what the pathogen was, this beta amyloid was trying to trap it and sequester it and help protect the body. But what happens is there's a waste removal system in the body, and it's like having a highway where there's too much traffic and it's all backed up, and people are trying to get off the off ramp, but there's a red light, and so it's just backing up. And that's what's really happening, I think, in a lot of cases is the body is trying to clear out the waste, but there's too much waste. And the system, which cleans out the waste. So when we sleep at night, so back to the glycocalyx and a newly discovered area called the lymphatic system, which is this pulsing system in the body that is helping take out that trash. When you have a nice restful night's sleep, the system of removing the trash is working properly. But we have such disrupted sleep now, that system isn't working well. We don't have good lymphatic drainage to get rid of the waste. So you're just getting this layered on buildup of waste. And in Parkinson's, the protein is called alpha synuclein. It's similar to beta amyloid, but it is also an antimicrobial peptide. So I think it's just now really people are starting to appreciate and understand these connections, but they've also found oral health is a huge piece of the puzzle that rarely gets talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But in the brains of people with Alzheimer's, they've found something called gingipains, which are molecules that are produced by the Porphyromonas gingivalis that is known to cause gum disease. And it can also be going on in the mouth, which is very close to the brain.
Yes.
Or in Parkinson's, they've talked about brain first and body first, and this potential colonization by pathogens that may come in initially through the nose and very close to that blood-brain barrier. There may be some microbial colonization going on in the brain.
Yeah. So that's again, so how do you then, I guess, probably looking at it more from a holistic perspective, we've talked about all the potential issues and exposure here, but what can people do? So I know we've touched on diet, we've talked about oral health, but yeah, if there's that exposure there, like you said, to pathogens that perhaps are creating that environment even close to your brain, what can people then do to navigate these situations and ensure they're managing their gut health and then their overall health and keeping that in a better place?
A couple of the basics that I always tell people is try to manage your stress, because stress, back to that driver of the gut brain. And by that, I'm not just psychological stress, nutritional stress. Understand that your body needs to be nourished, and it needs to be nourished with healthy, whole foods. And so that's a big key. And you have to overcome the barrier of I don't want to cook or that's too much trouble, because you really need to eat fresh, real food.
Yeah.
And that is a barrier for a lot of people. And then the water quality is a huge thing of really understanding, either buy mineral water, a good source of mineral water in a glass bottle. So I get Mountain Valley, or I think it's called Saratoga. Saratoga's in a blue bottle, Mountain Valley's in green. Those are glass bottles, so you're not going to be exposed to the microplastics there. And you want to be feeding a healthy microbiome, but you often can't start to feed a healthy microbiome until you have cleaned up the mess, if you have a mess. And to do that, it's important to understand, is my detoxification, are those pathways open? Is my lymph draining? You can either do lymphatic drainage self massage. There's lots of information about that on the internet. The little machines that jiggle, you stand on them, it's like a plate that can help move lymph. Walking is one of the best ways to move lymph, or getting one of those little mini tramps and jumping on that is going to move that waste out of the body. But you need to support your liver and your kidneys, because that's where that detoxification process happens. So once you're in a good place with knowing that you can eliminate, and that means knowing that you're having a healthy bowel movement every day. We didn't really talk about that, but I'm also known as the poop queen because we collected fecal samples for 7 years and learned a lot through that process. But it's very important that you're eliminating the waste every day. And I get frustrated when I see the experts say that it's normal for somebody to maybe only have a bowel movement 3 times a week. We know, if we have a pet, that we watch our pet, and our pet needs to go number 2 every day. And people who have a pet look at that because they're picking it up to put it in the trash can, and they know the quality of their dog's health from the stool sample. And so
Yeah.
understanding that is one of the best indicators of your health, and that you're actually having a bowel movement to remove the waste will then put you in a good position where you can start to say, okay, I want to start to reset my terrain. And that's where we come in with our sugar shift probiotic, is how we looked at changing sugar metabolism in the body, shifting out those endotoxin producing bacteria, and establishing an anaerobic gut environment again. But you have to go slow with that, because as you're shifting that terrain, you're killing off those microbes that produce that endotoxin. And so you've got to have those detox pathways open. And then you've got to set yourself up going forward that you have a quality fiber rich diet of the right kinds of fiber to feed a healthy microbiome,
Yeah.
and to make sure you're, as much as possible, it's not possible to be perfect. And we shouldn't get too caught up in being perfect, but you want to be mindful when you're out in restaurants, how you choose your food,
Yeah.
and asking the right kinds of questions about the food sources you're picking, or what might likely be the most beneficial or the least detrimental for your gut. Because you can get all of this set up and start to feel better, but if you go back to your old patterns of eating, you're just going to get back to the same place you were
Mhm.
before.
Yes, absolutely. And so what I'm hearing from you is, again, prioritizing that bowel movement so it's happening daily, and that sufficient source of fiber in your diet can help with that. Now, some other things that are often getting debated, and there's still not a lot of clarity around it, what type of oils people are using in their cooking, right? So olive oil people talk about, but then if you're actually cooking, is olive oil appropriate? Do you use something like avocado oil? So there's all kinds of mixed information out there. What are your thoughts around, when it comes to cooking your own meals? How do you make sure at least you're using the right oils, and why are the oils important?
Why are the oils important? Is so our cell membranes, or also the extracellular vesicles in that send around information in the body, are lipid membranes. And so fats are those lipids. And you hear omega 3 or omega 6 or omega 9 or medium chain. This is basically the size of the head group. An omega-3 is going to be small and very flexible. The longer the head group chain, because the tail goes into the inside of the lipid molecule, and you can only pack so much in there. So what happens is some of these altered fats and things that we've gotten, they don't have the flexibility, and they don't degrade. So you can get, I think it's some of the seed oils that they've shown, if they get incorporated into your membranes, that can take up to 2 years for them to break down, and where these smaller omega-3s would be recycled very rapidly. And you want your membranes to be fluid. You don't want them to be hard to penetrate and hard to break down, because we're constantly rebuilding our cellular cells. I think they've said, like, after 7 years, you're a completely new person. I personally, I use ghee in a lot of my cooking. If I'm going to be cooking with heat, I'll often add olive oil later, but I often use more ghee, or I use tallow, I use duck fat. But I try not to cook with a lot of oil, and I add it later, because part of what the issue is in that cooking process, you are altering or affecting the oil and how it can be used in the body.
Yeah. And then there's also the aspect of what we touched on earlier. The blood-brain barrier also gets compromised with depending on what oils we're using. So what's the composition of ghee that actually helps from that standpoint, and how does it differentiate from oil?
One of the ghee is clarified butter, and butyrate comes from butter. That's a good question, because I haven't really done a deep dive into the difference in specifically ghee, but ghee and butter,
Yes.
there's a big connection to the quality of it for sure, but vitamin A and the butyrate connection.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because I was having a conversation about this over the weekend too. So this is the second time someone's recommended ghee, so I'm probably going to make that switch over here. The other aspects of gut health, prioritizing some of the research I've done, prioritizing you're getting sufficient prebiotics, probiotics, fermented foods. So let's parse that out separately too. What are some good sources of prebiotics that people can have in their diet? And what are your thoughts around prioritizing these aspects, making sure our gut health is taken care of through what we're eating?
So prebiotic is really anything that feeds bacteria. So that can be prebiotic for good bacteria or bad bacteria. So back to looking at, and different fibers selectively feed different bacteria. So let's take bifidobacteria, which many people are depleted in, and that bifidobacteria prefers what's called xylo-oligosaccharide and galacto-oligosaccharides. So those are two different complex sugar molecules that bifidobacteria prefers. Now, you can get those in a supplement form, or there are foods that, specifically will provide the food for that. And when when bifidobacteria is grown by a fermenter, they will put in that prebiotics that specifically feed bifidobacteria in order to get more in the fermentation. When you eat a fermented food, of course, you're getting all of that together. And that's often cruciferous vegetables, which is interesting because they have a lot of powerful molecules. But you're getting the prebiotic, so the fibers in the plant and the specific sugars that can feed different bacteria. And then you're getting the living bacterial system, and they are cross-feeding each other. When that fermentation process starts, there's typically a leading microbe that comes in and makes it anaerobic, and then the lactic acid bacteria come in and produce the lactic acid and preserve the fermented food in vegetables and that sort of thing. Yogurt's a little bit different, making yogurt, but what you get, say, in a yogurt or a fermented food is you get the prebiotics, so what the microbes are feeding on. You get the live microbes.
Yeah.
And you get whatever those microbes produce. And so they're producing vitamins. So a lot of your B vitamins are made by bacteria. They're producing butyrate and propionate and acetate. So these important short chain fatty acids. So you're getting all of these molecules that the microbes are making. So that kind of whole picture of a fermented food. And that's actually how we designed our probiotics to be like a fermented food. And it's actually a myth. You'll hear advertising out there that somebody is the only probiotic that has pre, pro, and postbiotics.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is all probiotics have all three, because the specific microbe was grown in prebiotics to get the microbe to grow. And then it produced metabolites that it's known to produce in its metabolic processes. And then that whole solution is freeze-dried. And so you get, with each individual strain, you get pre, pro, and postbiotics.
Yes.
And the other myth that I like to dispel too is people are like, if some of the bacteria die, it's no good. That's actually part of the postbiotic, is the cell walls of the beneficial bacteria, which are have vast immune signals to the body. They make something called muramyl dipeptides, and they're very important in the immune system. So you want to have a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm hearing correctly, if I'm listening to this and I'm like, okay, there's a lot to do here, but if I were to simplify it, is it fair to say that if I just focused on consuming fermented foods on a daily basis, whether it's kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, those types of things, am I achieving my goal then from a dietary perspective?
That's a good question. It will certainly go a long way to helping support a healthy gut. But I will say some people who are in a rather dire situation with their gut may have really high histamine sensitivity. Foods produce histamines often.
Yeah.
Not always, but often. And so you can be very sensitive to those histamine producing foods until you get your gut healed. There's something called the GAPS diet that can help people with that. But again, you're going through a process of eliminating and healing the gut and then starting to understand what foods are inflaming my gut. But from a simple perspective, for the average person, just adding a little bite, even if you don't like sauerkraut, just have a teaspoon of it with every meal. And that is going to give you a lot of the enzymes and action from the microbes that you need to help digest that food.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing you mentioned earlier, but it's worth reemphasizing, is stress management too, right? Because if you're managing the diet, but your stress is not out of control, then you're not having the results, or you're not getting the results that you're seeking. Because when I talk to people, especially in the therapy side of things, the amount of people that report having irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and often it is related to stress. So that's showing up, right? So it's almost like approaching it in tandem.
Yes. And breathe. Of course, you hear people talk about breathing, but breathing is also what helps feed the glycocalyx. So that deep breathing into the lungs is bringing in oxygen and nitrogen. And there's something called pulmonary surfactant in our lungs that makes these little tiny nanobubbles of oxygen and nitrogen. And that's also what's fueling everything in our body. And I had a great talk with a nutritionist a month or two ago, and we were talking about stress and the impact on Parkinson's. And that people often think, okay, I've got this meditation app, I'm meditating once a day or whatever. And that it's really, the science is showing it's really more effective and more important to stop throughout your day and just take 2 or 3 really good quality breaths. Learn how to take those deep breaths and pull in and you'll just be amazed at what 3 good breaths can do to settle down the whole system.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you for adding that piece because yeah, a lot of the times when I'm working with people, my question is, do you pay attention to when you're breathing throughout the day? And we're just going about it and not really even consciously breathing at times. So it's definitely something that's important, not only from what you're sharing, but also in terms of regulating our nervous system, right? Which can help with stress management. Now, the other question before we move on the gut side of things, how do we know we've established an anaerobic gut microbiome? Because what I'm hearing from you, that is the goal.
So you're not going to know that unless you are doing some sort of a microbiome test.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me, most of the microbiome tests that are out there do not talk about anaerobic versus aerobic gut. So they give you a profile and kind of show you how it's changed, or they give you a score, and they're probably using something related to an anaerobic environment to do their score, but they don't specifically talk to you about that. I'm afraid I can't give you a great answer that I know of a company where you could go get it tested and they would tell you your gut is anaerobic. But what I can tell you, if it is anaerobic, you're going to have more bifidobacteria. You'll have, which is a keystone species. You'll have some Akkermansia, but not too much. So it won't be overgrown. Because those are some of those anaerobic bacteria that will not flourish if you have an aerobic gut.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fair. And the other thing you had talked about, somewhat unrelated, but also related, was your interest now in research in vitamin D deficiency. And again, from my perspective, there is a lot of talk about it, especially with daylight savings. We'll talk about it when we go into winter months. People will talk about seasonal affective disorders or the depression that comes with that. But I am curious from your perspective, because I don't feel that we're talking about it as much as we need to because of some of the impacts that people experience with the vitamin D deficiency.
Synthetic vitamin D that people are taking, it can be anti-inflammatory. So people, when they take it, they can feel better because it's anti-inflammatory, but it's not addressing the underlying problem, is that you're not converting vitamin D in your gut. So vitamin D binding protein is also known as GCMAF, so GC macrophage activating factor. And you can actually improve that by making yogurt. We have a recipe for that. But one of the things I wrote, I think it was on my Substack recently, is about inorganic phosphate, which again, back to that agricultural, the way we're growing our foods, we're using a lot of phosphate fertilizers. And inorganic phosphate actually disrupts the mechanism in the gut that converts vitamin D to the active form. And so when most people are having their vitamin D tested, they're not testing the active form. They're testing the storage form. And vitamin D also synthetic vitamin D can also be quite disruptive to iron recycling in the body. And this is also something that's not talked about a lot, but irons feed a pathogenic profile of gut bacteria. So you could be setting yourself up thinking you're doing something beneficial, but it's much more important to get your gut fixed and get out in the sun and start to make your own vitamin D and test for active D. It's a more expensive test. You have to specifically request it. I think it's about $100. But you won't know if you actually have active D unless you test for it.
And I think there's often a myth around that too, that if the days are shorter or we're in the winter months that I'm not getting enough sunlight. But what I've come to understand is it doesn't take a lot to just get out and get that early morning sunlight. Just that little bit of exposure can go a long way.
I have been talking a lot recently to some other practitioners and scientists who are looking at light and the importance of light spectrum. And we didn't talk about blue light. Here we are staring at our screens, and blue light can be very disruptive to all of those processes in the body because light is a signal. And when you're going out, and that's one of the things I tell people if they're having sleep trouble is drag yourself out of bed and go watch the sunrise. And at the end of the day, go out and watch the sunset. It's a signal in the body that's telling us something, and it's important information.
Yeah, so any bit of exposure helps. And to your point, because we've become so sedentary, we're sitting at our laptops, being exposed to the blue light, not getting enough of the red light that we need. But now there's a lot more research going on, and there's a lot of talk about infrared red light and being exposed to that as well. That's helping. But again, a lot of research needs to happen to understand the full impact of that as well.
It does indeed.
Yeah, yeah. Martha, I know we've covered a lot, so I really appreciate your willingness to come here and share your wisdom and your insight, which has been really helpful also for me. And I'm sure the listeners will get a lot out of this. But I just want to make sure if there's anything else you feel like we haven't touched on that's worth covering here as we bring this to a close.
I think we've covered a lot of the topics. What I hope people are coming away with is really how foundational your gut health is to your overall health. If you don't have a healthy gut, you're very likely not healthy. And I hope they picked up that one of the big and easy clues of understanding the health of your gut is that daily bowel movement and making sure that you're going, it's easy to go, you don't have diarrhea, you don't have constipation, you're eliminating waste on a daily basis. And that will be one of your strongest clues to your overall gut health. And actually, in a European study of a large, I think it was 2,500 people, they determined that Bristol stool scale, which is the scale they use to assess the stool and the frequency of your bowel movements, was the number 3 predictor of your long-term health.
Wow. Yeah. So some things that we often take for granted and just be as simple
Absolutely.
as that. Yeah. Martha, I appreciate all of that. Now, for listeners that want to learn more about your work, your Substack, some of the research you're doing and leading, how can people find all of that?
So you can find my Substack is Martha's Quest, and my name, Martha Carlin. And the work on our probiotics are at BiotiQuest. That's BioTiQuest. And then if you want to read a bit about the history of our journey in collecting stool samples and the science behind that, you can go to thebiocollective.com where it has a bit of that history. And then I also write about Parkinson's and the gut on a Martha's Quest website. So I have the Substack, which is a little bit different form than what I write specifically on the Parkinson's blog, which covers a lot more topics than just the gut, but a lot of alternative health things in Parkinson's disease.
Okay. No, that sounds great. Thank you again, Martha, and thank you for the work you're doing. I very much appreciated that you were able to come on here from your busy schedule and share with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a great conversation.